Glenbeck TV, he hosts his own popular radio and podcast programs with international audiences. With his wife, Susan, he hosts the weekly television show Ancient Jewish Wisdom on the TCT television network. He is best known for condensing millennia of ancient Jewish wisdom into practical and entertaining books, audio, and video resources accessible to people of every background. He has taught Hebrew wisdom from the Bible in more than 500 churches in North America, Europe, China, Africa, and the United Kingdom, and counts many Christian leaders among his closest friends. Lapin has been widely credited with inspiring countless Jews and Christians to return to active involvement in their respective faiths. After his studies in Bible, physics, and economics, he immigrated to the United States and soon after co-founded the Pacific Jewish Center in Los Angeles, California, with his friend radio host, Michael Medved. He and Susan homeschooled their 7 children and are well-known West Coast sailors. Rabbi Lapin, it is such an honor to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm happy you reached the end of that finally, but I know it pleased my mother, who I'm sure gazed down fondly.
An author, and
reached the end of that finally, but I know it pleased my mother, who I'm sure gazed down fondly.
Well, you know, when you've done so much in your life, you have a very long intro. So I am so excited. We just had a little time to chat before the show, and already I said, I need to hit record because we're already getting into so many good subjects.
Yeah.
And for those of you out there, I have already begun reading Thou Shalt Prosper. I'm loving every bit of it. I encourage you, while you're watching this right now, just download it on your iPad or whatever you have near. I'm also listening to the Business Secrets from the Bible on Audible, and I'm just enjoying the two in tandem. So I encourage you, go out there, buy the books, enjoy them. You're going to learn so much wisdom, and today is just going to plant a seed to start that wisdom growing so that you can become a profitable person in a multitude of ways. So Rabbi Lapin, tell us a little bit about what this book is about, why people want to come read it.
Yeah. Gosh, I should have known you were going to ask that question. I should have been better prepared, because there are different kinds of answers. For instance, one part of the answer is that over many years speaking to Christian audiences, and for many years I was, a rather unusual figure, very diffidently and almost apologetically. Many people would say, Rabbi, I really am not anti-Semitic in any way at all, but I feel I can ask you this question, you won't get offended. No, I won't get offended at all. I think it's something to be proud about.
Absolutely.
Where I come from, making money is a good thing, not something to be embarrassed by. And so I thought, this is a very valid question, and one worth providing an answer for, which I did. And I would explain to people, I said, look, that it's true is unarguable, whether in our, and I did consider that, although I didn't believe that was likely, if I was going to write a serious book about this, I did need to take that possibility seriously. And the way I resolved it was by interviewing over 100 non-Jewish Christian, mostly Christian business professionals who had lifelong relationships or business dealings with Jews. And what I found was exactly what you'd expect, which is there's bad apples in every group, and there's no more, no less among Jews than among anywhere else. But as an explanation for Jews' disproportionate success, impossible. That doesn't explain why it is that 1.5% of America's population comprise about 25 to 40% of the Forbes list of the 400 richest Americans every year. There's just too many Jews on that list. So I had to look into that. I also had to look into the silly racialistic explanation, which is that poor Jews got killed by the Cossacks, leaving the rich ones to reproduce. And what's wrong with that, of course, is that, first of all, there is no discernible money gene in Jewish sperm. And number two, if that were so, you wouldn't find dissipating of Jewish fortunes after several generations. So at the end of it all,
the poor Jews becoming rich ones later if it was just a gene.
And that's even a better argument. Yes, of course, made no sense whatsoever. And so finally, after debunking all the bogus explanations, I was left with absolutely no other idea other than that captured within ancient Jewish wisdom are hundreds, if not thousands, of tips and tools and techniques having to do with money. And that what happened is that, this gets absorbed. I mean, we read a portion of the Torah every week in synagogue, and boys turn 13 and have their bar mitzvah, and girls are 12 and they're expected to study. And meanwhile, at the dinner table, there's some conversation. And so what happens is, over the years, it gets absorbed into the culture. And so, whereas you do not find that many Jews playing defense in the National Football League, you just don't. And so their sons, the Jewish sons, are not busy compiling NFL statistics. They're looking at stock prices.
Right. And you have stories behind you. I thought about the part in your book where you talk about in any Jewish household, you go in and you see a lot of books. And there was a story in there that a man was coming to date a young woman, and the mom had cleaned up the room to make it really nice. And he almost walked out because he didn't see any books. And he thought, what would I have in common with these people?
Right. And we're in my study right now, and I could rotate the camera to show you bookcases on every single wall, just leaving a little space for the door and the window. So that is of course also part of it. And so I became absolutely fascinated, believing that I might be the only person seriously interested in economics and finance to look at this aspect of things without fear of being stigmatized as a bigot.
Mm-hmm. Have you experienced that at all?
Oh, a little bit. I get a certain amount of hate mail from Jewish people saying, stop perpetuating the myth of Jews and money.
And like you describe in your books, I mean, it's not a myth. It's been proven in every time in history.
They're being silly. They think that that's why they think that Gentiles don't like them because they've got money.
Oh.
And that's not the reason. They don't like him for many other perfectly good reasons. So,
especially when you're teaching us how to have money, we really like that, right?
Yeah,
you're teaching us your secrets.
Of course, absolutely. So, that's nothing to worry about. But I realized that this was something, and I started teaching it, and I just had many beautiful adventures. Very often, I'm sorry to say, but it is very, very common for me to find churches, Christian churches, in which the false equation of poverty equals virtue.
Yes, let's talk about that.
Believed in practice. And it's hugely problematic, of course.
Yes.
And so I love doing seminars and teaching programs at churches, and then coming back 6 months or a year later and hear the testimonies of how people's lives have been turned around, and how even the church, all of a sudden, from being a church that didn't replace the light bulbs and didn't do painting when it was needed because they were always short of money, all of a sudden turned into a church of people who had money to tithe instead of a church of very poor people. So
important. And I want to talk about tithing in a minute, because that's one thing I teach. I teach classes to Russian orphans, and actually when I teach a business class, the thing that they'll tell you I repeat the most is read Proverbs. It'll tell you everything you need to know about business. But I want to talk a little bit about something we addressed right before the show. And I always kind of joke that as Christians, we get so afraid of the prosperity gospel that we go all the way over to the depravity gospel instead. And you were talking about there's a difference between prosperity gospel and being prosperous. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, it's a difference between prosperity gospel and ancient Jewish wisdom's teaching on money. A prosperity gospel is rightfully criticized because essentially what it says is, basically it's just the religious version of the attraction principle or the secret. And these are silly notions intended to flim-flam gullible people into wasting their time and even worse. So it basically says that if you pray hard enough to God for whatever you want, you'll get it.
Right.
So please, God, I for a long time, I've been asking you for a Ferrari, but I've thought about it and I want to change it to a Porsche, if that's okay with you. And then they say, well, I guess God didn't hear my prayers. Of course he heard your prayers. He did. And then he answered you. He said no.
Right. Or he said, go out and work for it, right?
Well, that's exactly the point. You're right. Because, the answer is no, that's not how it works. This is not a religious welfare organization where you knock on the door, pray to God, tell him what you need, and hope he unloads on you and lets you have it. No, that's not. And I'm not saying prayer doesn't have a place, but prayer's role is in addition to action, not instead of action.
Right.
And so what we Jews believe that God is really saying, and the evidence for this from Scripture is immense. What he's really saying is, I need for you to be obsessively preoccupied with the needs and the desires of all my other children. And if you do that, I'll incentivize you, I'll reward you with the incredible blessing of financial abundance. Now, how does that work? Well, you think about it, that the first time that we see God getting grumpy, because right through the days of creation, God thinks everything is good.
Oh, right.
And then when's the first time we see God getting grumpy?
Man
Then
alone.
he finally says, it's not good for man to be alone. But up till then, everything was good. This is the first time that it's not good. And what we realize from studying the Hebrew text is that this is not God talking exclusively about Adam getting married to Eve. This is a general statement for everybody in every place in every time. Being disconnected from my other children is not going to be good for you. So now, if I want you to all start caring for one another, this is a little bit like an ordinary father who has a few children, and the last thing he wants to see is those children fighting. And so what he does is, as these children are growing up, every time that they care for one another and are kind to one another and play nicely with one another, he rewards them. And whenever they squabble, he penalizes them all. And so eventually, little by little, they learn. And his hope is that by the time he moves onwards to God's embrace, his children by that time will be sufficiently educated and conditioned and taught to care for one another and love one another. Well, that's a little bit like our Father in heaven as well. He also wants to see us caring for one another. And it's fine if we do that through the miracle of something he gave us called money. So he set up a system whereby the only way that I can get money if I want it, which I do, the only two ways are with a gun or by pleasing another human being. Those are my two choices. I can either take it from you by force, or I can make something that you want and sell it to you, or I can do some work that you need done and have you pay me for that. Those are the only two ways of making money. And so God has essentially set up a system where I spend 10 hours a day trying to please other people in the hope that they will buy my goods. What could be better than that? And when you think about it, that's what a purchase is.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why it's so important to understand. Imagine, if you would, let's say I walk into a shoe store because I want one of those sneakers with red lights in the heel that flash when you walk. And so I walk in there, and the storekeeper goes down on his knees, just like in a house of worship.
Mm-hmm.
Except there we call it a worship service, and here we call it customer service.
Yes.
But it's both service. And he goes down on his knees, and he takes off my old shoes, and he says, try on this pair for size. He puts them on, ties them, and then I stand up, walk around. I say, I feel like I'm walking on a cloud of sugar candy. This is great. I love this. And he says, well, would you like me to wrap them? I said, no, not at all. You can, throw away the old ones. I'm going home in these. And he says, that'll be $20. I give him the $20 and I walk out. Now, which one of us is happy and which one of us is miserable?
Both are happy.
We're both happy.
That's right.
And yet, in the minds of the Marxists, somebody is exploiting somebody else. But the truth is, he's happy and I'm happy. And what's more than that, we've both benefited financially. How is that?
Yes.
Well, let's do a little thought experiment. Why don't you come tap me on my shoulder and say, Rabbi Lapin, I see you've got a pair of shoes of the kind that the lights flash in the heel when you walk. It's just what I want. Can I buy them from you? I believe they cost $20. And I said, go in the store. I just got them. Get your. He said, they're out of them. You got the last pair. I said, oh, okay, fine. Will you accept $20 for them? What do I say?
No.
No. Why would I?
Right.
I'm sorry. I waited for a long time to find these in my. No, absolutely not. He said, okay, I'll give you $25. Forget it. $30. I'll give you $30. I said, look, I'm sorry. That's not happening. He says, okay, fine. $50. That's my last offer. Now, I'm starting to think. I'm not an idiot. I'm Jewish. Eventually, I'll find enough. This is a decent profit for about 5 minutes of work. And I said, you know what? Fine. $50, you got them. And I'll go home barefoot. Fine. But what we've really done with this little experiment, we've just established that by my interaction with the storekeeper, I have changed my financial statement. My financial net worth went up from the $20 that I had in my pocket to now an asset worth $50.
Right.
We've just proved it. I wouldn't sell it for less than $50. And we can also go to the storekeeper and say, hey, you know what? Lapin walked out of your store with a pair of shoes that belong to you. If you like, we can bring him back. We'll get your shoes back, and you just give him back his $20. Storekeeper says, why would I want to do that? Those shoes cost me $10 from the factory. I've gained a profit of $10. I've now got 20. I'm as happy as could be. And the Marxist goes home pulling his hair out because he can't figure out how this can be.
Right.
And this is what God set up, that through the miracle of economic interaction, two people can be happier than they were before.
And I want to touch on that economic interaction. As I've been listening and reading your books, you talk about business and the interaction of money actually being a spiritual interaction. And I love the difference when you were explaining, if an animal can understand something, and if only humans could understand. Could you tell our audience a little bit about the differentiation between physical and spiritual activities and how money is part of that?
It's important to understand that when I speak about physical and spiritual, I'm not wearing my rabbi hat. I'm wearing my engineer hat. I worked as an electrical engineer for many years. And so I'm talking strictly scientifically here. Physical is any quality or commodity that can be measured in a laboratory. Spiritual is something which cannot be measured in a lab.
Mm.
So my skin color is very physical. My weight, physical. My height, physical. How much hair I have or not, physical. How about my integrity? How about my resilience? How about my resourcefulness? How about my optimism? How about my communicative ability? These are all spiritual factors. You can't measure them in a lab. There is no instrument that can measure any of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really important to get that, because when my pet chimpanzee sees me coming home from work and sitting down in a chair, he gets that. You know, he also has moments of tiredness. When he sees my wife put a great big wonderful dinner in front of me and we sit down to eat, he really gets that. And if I go to sleep, he even gets that. But when I pick up a newspaper to read, that he doesn't understand, because that's a spiritual activity. Words are spiritual. Animals understand much, but not words. In other words, words being an abstract representation of reality, my chimpanzee doesn't understand either the spoken word or the written word. He will understand certain sounds and tones of my voice as certain commands that he will obey if he wants any dinner. But he won't understand when I pick up my checkbook or my credit card and I go over to a store and I wander around the store, and eventually I walk out with a new cell phone and I hand over this paper to the store owner. My chimpanzee who came along for the trip is totally bamboozled. He has no idea of what's going on. And if you think about it, money, there is no instrument that can tell the value of money. Now, we have vending machines which we have programmed to be able to evaluate the relative value of money in order to be able to give me a Coca-Cola out the chute. But in terms of being able to intrinsically know whether a piece of paper is worth something or is not, or why should it be that a piece of paper that weighs very little is worth so much more than a round coin called a quarter that weighs so much. These things make no sense on a physical level.
Right.
And it's even worse than that, because I could even say to you, what is money? Is it really those metallic discs jingling in my pocket? Or is it the strips of colored paper in my wallet? Or how about maybe it's the magnetic orientation of the iron oxide molecules in the magnetic strip behind my credit card? Is that money? Right. Or maybe it's the ones and zeros in my bank's hard drive. Or maybe when I write a check to you for $10, maybe that's money. Or maybe when we shake hands and I say, I'll pay you $10 on Friday, maybe that action is also, yeah, you're right, it's all of these things. Money cannot be pinpointed. And another proof of money being spiritual is that I can change its value without coming anywhere near you. I can change the value of the money you've got without coming anywhere near you. Mm-hmm. All I've got to do is use my social media and my radio show to convince a large number of people in our city that things are going downhill and that there's going to be a depression very, very soon. And if I can persuade people of that, you'll find that your money loses value. And I don't even know you, and yet from a distance, I've reduced the value of your money. Well, that's because it is spiritual, not physical. I cannot change the value of a slice of rhubarb pie on your table.
Right. And even I was thinking, as you, I've heard someone say one time, and I think you would probably agree, that money represents the best humanity has to offer, because you only pay for the best thing. You pay for the things that you consider worth your exchange.
Well, that's right. I'm not sure it's necessarily the everything, because it's not necessarily going to buy love or some of the other things. But although it's not irrelevant in that area, I should point out. And any woman who does not take into account the finances and financial wisdom of a man she's thinking of marrying is a fool.
Absolutely. One of the number one things couples fight about, right?
Of course, of course. And I can't tell you how many young women I've counseled who, in a very idealistic mood, end up marrying a guy who has zero financial prospects, but he is a very spiritual man. And I tell them, listen, I'm as helpful as I can be, but I can't waste my time. And so if you go ahead with this, my door is not available to you when you want to cry about the fact that you can't afford the things you need to even look after your future children. No, now's the time to be thinking of those things. And it's not just an abstract about, how much money a man's got. That's not it at all. It's his entire relationship to money. And money then represents the sum total of his relationships, his skills, his expertise. There's so much to it that you really get quite an interesting insight into a man by examining his relationship to money. And a lot of women do not get this at all, until it's too late, by the way.
Absolutely. I think I heard of a Harvard business study that was done, I believe it was over 60 years. And I don't know the exact statistics, but it said that the men, it was all men at the time that they were doing it, who reported having warm personal relationships made disproportionately more. I think it was Harvard students, so it was hundreds of thousands of dollars more annually than the ones who didn't report warm personal relationships. And so this tie between relationships and money that you really talk about in your book, that everything, which is why it's so spiritual, is relational.
That's right.
It's relational with your customers and caring for them. And I love how you talked about in the book, even if you're an employee, that you look at your boss as your number one customer, and
That's right.
and his customers as your customers of your customer. And yes. One of my favorite stories in there so far has been the lady who was working as a clerk at a grocery store.
She was working as a cashier.
Yes, as a cashier.
In a supermarket, you're quite right. And she was, by the way, I don't know how much, I don't recall how much I told about it, but this was in a church in Tennessee. Did I mention that it was in Tennessee?
I don't think so.
No, it was in Tennessee. And it wasn't in any of the big cities. It wasn't in Nashville or Memphis or anyway, it doesn't matter. But I was, funnily enough, just today I was trying to think of the city it happened in. Anyways, I did this whole program, and she, again, I was due to come back to follow up, because sometimes with churches it takes 3 or maybe 4 seminars in order. And virtually all the members of the church was showing up for all of these. It was great. Wow. And so on a later occasion, I was back at the same church. Woman shows up, and same woman. Now, I mean, I'm not going to try and tell you that I have an intimate familiarity with women's fashions. I don't. But I can tell the difference between Sears and St. John. It's called St. John, isn't it?
I'm not sure which one to say, but yeah, or Louis Vuitton or something, right?
She's wearing an outfit. I'm not saying it cost $3,500, but she's wearing a $600-700 outfit.
Nice.
The last time I was, and I remember her very clearly. I mean, she was an attractive woman. She made an impression, and the last time she's wearing a $49 special. Something has happened.
Yeah.
And I couldn't wait to talk to her after the seminar was over, but apparently neither could she, because she was right there. And I said, well, I'm really happy to see you. And I said, there are things about you that I'm particularly happy to see. She said, oh, yes, I thought you'd noticed. She said, well, you said something last time that really got me, which was that I've got to see myself as being in business for myself. Mm-hmm. The grocery store is my customer, not my employer. She says, and I started thinking about what the implications of that are. And up till then, I realized my head was always down. I was hunched over, and I was I was looking at each item that I was running through the scanner and putting in people's bags. She says, I wasn't even aware who the customer was. She said, I totally changed that. I've been doing this stuff long enough. I can scan without even looking. Done. Finished. Says, I never took my eyes off their face. I do the credit card. I notice the name. Next time that customer's there, I address them by name. And she says, and I worked to that, and I got better and better and better at it. And eventually I saw that people went out of their way, even if there was a slightly longer line, to come to my checkout counter, so I would check them out. And I'd always greet them and ask them how they're doing. And eventually I got to know more and more about them. And one day, there's a guy at the end of the line. Finally, when everyone's gone, he comes through and he checks out some stuff, and I greet him by name. And he says, what time do you get off work? And she says, why? He says, I'd like to meet with you. She says, look, I'm flattered. That's very nice of you, but that's not where I'm at the moment. I've got 2 kids. I'm not looking for social engagement. He apologized. He said, no, I'm married as well. I'm not looking for a social engagement either. I want to discuss a business proposition with you. So they meet up after work at the coffee shop. And he says, I've got a very successful real estate company. A few weeks ago, my front office person left, and I need somebody to be my face to the public. And he says, I've just watched how you've interacted the last little while. He says, you don't have to answer me now. Here's my card. My offer is so much. And she says to me, he offered me 2.5 times what I'm making at the grocery store. So she says, bottom line is, I've been working there for the last 2 months, and I'm doing very well, and I love it. And that's all thanks to what you've been teaching. I said, well, let's hear it for ancient Jewish wisdom. Score another victory.
Absolutely. You can't argue with such a time-tested wisdom. And it's amazing because it changed her entire life, not only her work day, how that looked, but I'm sure in that $700 outfit versus the $49 special, she probably held her shoulders back more and her head up higher.
Oh, Reina, she looked like a totally different person.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then if she was, because I remember she was a single mom when she.
Yeah, that's correct.
Right. And then if she was looking for a prospect, she's probably going to find a lot better presenting herself in such a fashion. And so we think about that. Anything, I think, as you're speaking, it's really coming to me that anything that's a spiritual activity that you invest in and get better in, which money being a spiritual activity, it bears fruit in all spiritual.
Doesn't it just?
Right.
Yeah, of course.
Right. And so that's why throughout your books, we keep seeing that return to relationship. And that's what she did. She established relationships with every single customer who came through her line. And
this is true for all of us in whatever we do.
Mm-hmm.
How many people actually go out of their way to make new friends? But it's very important. A lot of people also say to me, you know what, I'm sorry, it's just not me. I'm not a gregarious person. I'm more of an introvert. I'm just, I understand that. But when you were a teenager, with a face full of pimples, did you just walk around saying, hey, what can I do? I'm just a pimply person. I don't think so. If I remember correctly, you spent the equivalent of a small nation's gross domestic product on pharmacological products to clear your face.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't accept it. So why are you accepting it? Who says your state of being an introvert has to be that way? It's simply not true.
Absolutely.
And so I work a lot with my own clients and with the public at large that follows me, very much on recognizing that one of the huge differences between people and animals is that a cat or a camel or a cow or a kangaroo are going to be a cat and a camel and a cow and a kangaroo in 5 years' time. But a human being can change hugely in 5 years. Mm-hmm. I can effect such tremendous change that my life is entirely different. Human beings are not the same today as they were 5 years ago. Animals are.
Yes, and you talk about in the book, the Hebrew word for the word Hebrew is one who transitions, is it?
Man, I can't tell you what fun it is doing a conversation with somebody who actually knows something about this topic. This is amazing. I do a lot of interviews, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Sorry?
I've been fascinated with this. I've really felt that God has put it probably on all of our hearts, but I've accepted it. Just as you talk about Moses went and checked out the burning bush, right? Like I've accepted it that God's put it on my heart to be a prosperous person, and that as he prospers me, it prospers everyone around me.
Yes.
And people that I didn't know, because I meet more people through being prosperous, and I'm able to, even the orphans I have in Russia have started their own businesses now, and things that, people thought they couldn't do because they were orphans at one point. And, by studying this and becoming more prosperous in myself, I know that I can continue to serve the world in a better and bigger capacity. So I've been writing notes in my phone when I'm reading your book and listening. And
really
I've
important.
just really been absorbing it all, just loving this.
It is very,
and
very
important.
Talk
about Hebrew, the word Hebrew meaning, is it he who transitions?
Yes, exactly. It is to transition, and that's the essence of this, not to say, well, I am what I am. No, you're not. You are what you could be tomorrow.
And you talk also about the Jewish culture. One of the things that really sets it apart from other cultures throughout the ages is that they really embrace change and accept it as a fact of life.
Well, change, we all recognize that change is scary.
Yes.
Of course it is. All change is scary, and we know that, and this is depicted in the book of Exodus, that the majority of the Israelites in Egypt rather stayed in the oppression they endured there than venture out into the unknown with Moses. What does not come through on most English translations that I have looked at is what is very clear in the Hebrew, which is that 80% of the Hebrews chose to stay in Egypt.
Really?
Mm.
Oh,
that's amazing.
You're right.
Only 20% left.
So only 20% actually even left is the Egypt at all.
Isn't that incredible?
Mm. But it makes sense. I mean, really, you think about that 80-20 principle of life, that 20% is going to give you 80% of the results. Right.
Yeah. Mm.
And
I think the number, by the way, the number of Americans 244 years ago, the number of Americans or colonials who actually were willing to take up arms and achieve independence from Britain, I think was about the same sort of figure.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I would imagine.
And
especially
it makes total sense because, my wife and I have often asked ourselves, what would we have done back in that day? And the allure of the familiar is almost irresistible.
Not to mention, a lot of the people who had come over had already been through wars
that
they lost to the British.
Yeah.
And so to think, all right, try again.
Yeah, no, hard to know what we would have done. But yes, part of ancient Jewish wisdom is not dealing with change, but embracing change.
Yes.
And, I don't want to tie the topic of our conversation too much to necessarily just this brief period in history while we're talking.
Yes.
But a lot of people have said to me, under these conditions of the coronavirus, etc., I don't know how I'm going to manage. And I have to help people understand. It's absolutely true that there are just as many opportunities under difficult times as under good times.
Right. If an entrepreneur, our job is to solve problems. And so when there's new problems, we have jobs to go after.
Yes.
And the audience watching this knows that I actually, myself and someone I published a book with last year, right when coronavirus hit, within a few weeks, we actually threw a 5-day summit with 85 speakers teaching people how to start online businesses, how to, market themselves here. And so that you could come and in 5 days, watch all the material, not all the material, but to get started to change with the times that are changing now. And with that said, though, I want to talk about your opinion, and you didn't share it with me. You just gave me a little teaser before the show on what to do in this time. You talk about face-to-face interaction so much in the book, which we know is so important to human existence.
Yes.
What do we do right now when we're behind a screen all the time with people?
Look, the important thing I think to remember is that every single increase in technology with respect to human connectivity has resulted in a huge and monumental growth in wealth.
Yes.
And so if we go all the way back to the 17th century, ships, and then all of a sudden we find that in the 18th century, and then on a late 18th and early 19th century, we got steamships, and all of a sudden the distance between Europe and America across the Atlantic was cut down to a third. There was this huge increase in wealth. It was remarkable. Mm-hmm. And then came railroads, another massive increase in wealth creation. And then came in 1844, came the telegraph. The first time in human history that a message could travel faster than a man on horseback.
Yeah, incredible.
And so all of a sudden, folks in Philadelphia could find out what wheat is selling for in Chicago today, right now.
Right now.
So the telegraph was like the internet of its day. It was a huge creator of wealth.
Yeah.
And then 1900 came the telephone. And again, a massive increase in wealth. Mm-hmm. And then came radio, advertising on radio, huge. Then came television. And then in 2000 came the internet with, again, a huge growth of wealth. Every time anything increases and improves human connectivity, we have a growth rate. Obviously, the government's reaction to the pandemic has been the opposite of connectivity for obvious medical reasons. And so it's been separation of people. Naturally, the result is the opposite of creation of wealth, the erosion of wealth. It's without question problematic. But how quickly we adjust. Turns out that e-commerce skyrocketed during the first few months of 2020.
And that was the direction of a lot of things. It seems we have these little directions and then it takes off. Even this show right now, you're on the East Coast, I'm on the West Coast. And when we first started this show out last year, I was doing these in person. I was going to each church and business and so forth. And because of coronavirus, it kind of gave that reason that they have to take place online. And I've been able to interview people all over the world instead of
right. But let's not assume that there's no difference. We're doing well. We're having a lovely conversation. But I think it would be quite different if we were face to face. It would be a different level conversation. So we must recognize that it's not the same. But heaven knows this is way better than nothing. It's a whole lot better than that. So there are opportunities that open up all the time, provided one does not get dispirited and pessimistic.
Well, that's all through the Hebrew scriptures, right? Is the 80% that does get dispirited. And sometimes it's just a few people who maintain that faith that God is going to continue to work and that He's faithful. Is that something that is continuously taught through Jewish families, that God is faithful and we need to not be these 80% who either just don't even leave Egypt or sit around complaining to Moses that they would have rather died in Egypt than... Yeah,
but it's, let's remember the wonderful story of the prophet Elisha, who was approached by the widow, and she said to him, my late husband was your faithful servant, and I'm now left with nothing. I'm absolutely destitute. You have to help me. And he says, go search your house and bring anything you can find. Mm-hmm. She says, let me save you the trouble. She says, there's nothing there. When I tell you my house is empty, we've sold everything in order to try and survive. I got nothing. And he insists, you must go back, go and find anything. So she's a bit frustrated with this because he's just obviously doesn't want to help her. But she goes and finds a forgotten and overlooked tiny little bottle of oil. She brings it back. He's, oh, this is wonderful. I'm so pleased you found that. This is great. He says, now what you need to do is go and borrow 10,000 40-gallon drums. She says, what? He said, just go and borrow empty drums. And she comes back and he takes the bottle and he starts pouring And at the rate of about 40 gallons a minute, this tiny little bottle fills up a drum every minute. And he says, now get somebody to help you carry off the oil to market. The woman becomes an oil tycoon.
She does.
And so
and it lasts all the way through the famine, right?
You see the obvious question, which is that if he's going to pour 40 gallons a minute out of a teensy-weensy little bottle of oil, it was a miracle. God did it, right? And if God did it, why couldn't God have let him pour the oil out of his thumb? I mean, from God's point of view, there's no more or less of a miracle needed to make oil pour out of a thumb than out of a little bottle.
Right.
So why did this prophet trouble the old widow? Why didn't he just use his thumb? And the answer, which I know you subscribe to, is that deliverance only comes when you are also invested in it. It can't come from outside.
Right. And in, in the Christian faith, we think about Jesus taking the loaves and the fishes, right, and giving thanks and spreading those out to thousands with baskets of leftovers, right? And of course, we read this story too. You think about, you have to bring what you have. And then what you have can be multiplied and poured out to increase and increase and increase. But if you say you don't have anything like that, like the woman did in the first place,
you may believe that, but it's not true.
And so you have to, I guess, also acknowledge the gifts God has already given you. And so that when you can acknowledge and be grateful for the gifts God has already given you.
Maybe it's a resource, maybe it's a skill, maybe it's an experience, maybe it's an ability, but you've got something, I guarantee it. Now, all we've got to do is find it and learn how to monetize it.
Absolutely. And the woman did that. And these are the stories that, and this is another thing about growing up in a Jewish household that's constantly reading the Torah and constantly educating, is that you're hearing these stories not just once, not just twice, but over and over and over again throughout your life. And that becomes, as the Bible says, written on the tablet of your heart, rather than just something you heard one time or a nice story. It really becomes something that you naturally would live out. Is that right?
Exactly right. Yeah,
right.
Very much so.
And so this is something that, of course, not all of us can come from, that background, but we can begin to.
No, and that's why, when I wrote Thou Shalt Prosper, was specifically to make ancient Jewish wisdom in the area of finance accessible to everybody of every background.
Yes, and I love how you've done that. And I love that we can really take this and leave a legacy moving forward as humans, whether we're Jewish or Christian or anything else, and take this wisdom and these cultural benefits that have benefited Jewish children that become business owners and productive members of society throughout all places in the world, throughout all history and time that we know of, and start instilling these in our children to come and our children to come, the ways that God has laid out for us to live a successful life in money, in relationships, in our every part of our beingness as human beings, to really live the spiritual teachings of God.
And completely overcoming the very natural reticence and misgivings that people have about money, and realizing that money didn't just accidentally come into being by wicked people while God's attention was distracted by some local trouble spot. Money was God's plan for human economic interaction.
Absolutely. And we see it over and over again in the scriptures. So sometimes when people, I talk to them and they say money's the root of all evil, or all these phrases we have to downplay the importance of money, I say, how come then when Solomon asks God for wisdom, God gets so excited, he gives him a whole bunch of money as well, that Solomon can then go forward and be even more influential with that wisdom. And that people like the Queen of Sheba and people from afar will come and seek that wisdom because of all that God has provided him. If that were bad, why would God give all these figures throughout the Bible wealth and influence, when they've been obedient to him and, God's pleased with them?
Yeah, absolutely.
To think that would be bad, to me, it just doesn't make any sense when we're reading these scriptures that God has put forth for us. So there's something that I haven't got to in the book, and I want to ask you before I get there.
Yeah,
you talk about balancing all four motivators to achieve the maximum success in all aspects of life. What are those four motivators?
You sure you want to peek ahead?
Yes.
Okay, fine.
I'll absorb it more when it comes.
All right, fine.
It'll be that repetition that the Jewish kids get growing up.
You're right about that, actually. Yeah. Sure. Okay, look. You and me, we are both physical and spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
We both have physical needs, and we also have spiritual needs. So there are certain things that are important to us which cannot be measured in a lab and which my pet chimpanzee does not get. For instance, we want our friends to think well of us.
Mm-hmm.
That's a spiritual need.
Yeah.
We want a connection with God. That's a spiritual need. We want a feeling that we understand how God's world works. We don't want to feel, like an Englishman being dropped into his first baseball game.
Yeah.
He's not going to be able to play, and I know of what I speak. Trust me.
I've tried to play cricket, so I know the opposite of that.
Yeah, right. It's nice to understand the rules of the game that we find ourselves in, and that desire to know the rules, it's also spiritual. So we obviously have physical needs, but we also have spiritual needs. Now, this world in which we live has the ability to convey to us physical commodities, right, like an apple or a drink of water.
Yeah.
All things that my chimpanzee understands. But this world also has the ability to convey to us things that are spiritual, such as understanding, such as esteem. These are things that come to us from the world outside of us, but they're not physical, they're spiritual things. And so what we end up with, and the reason it ends up being 4, as you said, is that you end up with a little 2x2 matrix. And the 2 vertical columns are what the world provides in spiritual and physical form. And the 2 horizontal columns are what I need in physical and spiritual form. And so if we take a look at the first quadrant, where the physical supply of the world matches my physical needs, you will see that in there are food and shelter, basically.
Okay.
How about the physical things that the world supplies, which is the square just underneath that, the physical things that the world supplies, but they fulfill my spiritual need. In other words, I will not die if I don't get them, but they contribute greatly to the fullness of my life. That would include a savings account, life insurance, a boat.
Yeah, to go sailing.
Right, exactly. Will I die without any of these things? No, of course not. They fill a spiritual need of mine, that's all. But the world supplies them physically. And then I've got to think about the things that I need physically. That's the next square on top over. I need them physically, but the world supplies them spiritually. Now, this is an interesting one. One of the things in this square is the esteem and friendship of other people. Well, you might say, I don't understand. Why would you die without that? Because this is a physical need of mine supplied spiritually by the world. Nothing, the chimpanzee will not notice anything being handed over to me, like when he saw an apple coming to me.
Right.
But this is just that people in the world like me. What's that got to do with my physical survival? Well, if we note, are you actually in Los Angeles?
Yes.
Then I don't have to tell you about the homeless problem.
Yeah.
Well, one of the distinctive characteristics of the overwhelming majority of the homeless people is disconnection.
Yes.
Disconnected from family, disconnected from friends, disconnected from work, from employers. They are very, very disconnected people.
Yes, I've heard it said that you become homeless not when you run out of money, but when you run out of relationships.
There you go. Beautiful way of putting it. You're 100% right.
Yeah.
Without relationships, you actually do deteriorate. You stop taking care of yourself. You go downhill and you die.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's very much of a physical need.
Yeah, that's one thing. Whenever I before COVID, that is, saw a homeless person, if I was going to go bring them food or something, I would make an effort to touch them on the elbow or something, because they haven't had
very important. Yes,
a physical touch in so long. So many of them, haven't been touched by another human in so long, and that spiritual, physical need to just know that there's real human contact.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And then the fourth quadrant.
The fourth quadrant is spiritual and spiritual. It's what I need spiritually and what the world supplies spiritually. And this includes wisdom and knowledge and understanding. You won't die without it. The proof is how many people walking around don't have it. And it also is connection with God.
Yeah. So
those are the four categories, and those are the four motivations. Now, many psychologists like Abraham, I'm sorry, I forget his name for the moment. He speaks of the four levels of need. He's just, they've just found other ways of expressing this.
And Maslow's hierarchy, there's all kinds of...
Maslow, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah. Abraham Maslow is what I was thinking of. But bottom line is that this is what they are, and this is the way of understanding why we do. As we are both body and soul. We're not just body, we're not just soul. Yeah. We're neither apes nor angels. We're somewhere in between. That is why there are these four areas, and keeping these four areas satisfied is really at the core of a successful and fulfilled life.
Absolutely. One thing I want to touch on before we go too, you mentioned that movies and TV, our general pop culture, they conspire to make us poor. And even sometimes, church messages can. So tell us about how pop culture tends to lean towards making us poor. It romanticizes that, perhaps.
Well, it's worse than romanticizes. You see, what we've got to understand is that, again, at the present time, and I hope that many people will watch these shows of yours years and years into the future, and I hope that by the time they do in the future, some of these problems will have been resolved. But right now, at this time in history, Marxism is in the ascendancy. Young people find it very attractive. And instead of calling it Marxism, because it's giving a great deal of credit to a very unworthy and unimpressive individual, but we should really just call it secular fundamentalism. It's another belief system. And part of the belief of secular fundamentalism, see, how do you distinguish between a tennis club and a religion? A religion has to answer the question of where we came from. A tennis club doesn't. And there really are only two explanations for how we got to this rather lonely speck of planetary substance on the outer reaches of a galaxy far, far away.
Yeah.
Why? And how did we get here? And the two explanations are, you've got to pick one of them, because there isn't a third. Nobody has ever yet told me of a third way. And I've said these things for many, many times. The one way is that a good and loving God created us in his image and put us here. That's one way. I can't prove it, neither can you. But I know that's what happened. But there's another explanation for how we got here. And that is through a lengthy process of unaided materialistic evolution, primitive protoplasm turned into ballerinas and bookkeepers. You shouldn't laugh, because it's really rude to laugh at other people's religious beliefs.
You know, I actually, I used to be fascinated by this subject because that was often the big debate, right? And I read this book by an astrophysicist and a biochemist, and neither of them were religious when they started. But they came to the conclusion through all their studies that though an amoeba can be grown in a petri dish, and it can sprout legs and evolve, for the amount of time that it would take for an amoeba to do that, first of all, we would have to be billions and billions and billions of years older.
That's exactly why they postulate a billion-year universe.
Right, and they said the Earth was so volatile with volcanoes and all kinds of things that there's no way that amoeba could have ever survived in the volatility of the Earth at the time. And so they came to the conclusion, these non-religious scientists that were studying it, that whether or not there was a God, and they actually did become religious later, they said life had to be spontaneous and complex by all of the science. There was no way we could have started.
That's it's beautiful, but it's obviously not a compelling proof of anything, because otherwise there wouldn't be any people left to still believe in evolution.
Well, we were taught in schools, you know, from little kids that you started as a non-human primate, then you became, you know, these, and
this is the lesson. When you go to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., when you go to the primate section of all the creatures, including my former pet chimpanzee, they basically show that man should have been in one of those cages also.
Maybe some. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, very true. That's right. So, and so, if it's very important to believe that we are derived from animals, that means we are animals. We're just sophisticated, that's all. And if we are animals, then it doesn't make any sense that we have money, because money is too spiritual. No animals use money.
Right.
It's an abstract representation of value, no. And so that's one of the reasons that the left hates property. You know, ownership of private property in its ultimate is despised by the left.
Very spiritual. That's something that an animal would not understand, to own.
Correct. Yeah.
And something that's taught throughout the scriptures is, you know, like Abraham got this property, Lot got that property. This is where the property lines were drawn. This is so that we can expand.
And they believe that all property should be owned by us all in unison by the government. And so that is why in the culture you'll find words like filthy rich.
Yeah.
I assure you it's a lot filthier to be poor.
Absolutely. And, you know, they say money is the root of all evil, but it's often poverty that drives you to do evil acts that you wouldn't have done.
No, I'm not sure, because that's a slur on my grandparents who never had 2 pennies in their whole lives.
I guess I mean to like steal.
And you never stole. They never stole a loaf of bread.
That's true. That's true. Not everybody does, but you know, you don't have that. If you have the means, well, there's some people who are just, you know, they have a problem in their mind. But, you know, someone who's stealing a loaf of bread to fill their stomach, you know, that's because of poverty, not because of wealth. And
no, that's right.
There's a proverb, also, right? Not to make me too poor that I would steal, but it also says not to make him too wealthy that he would. But, well, Rabbi Lapin, it has been such a pleasure.
Under normal circumstances, I'm on the West Coast a lot, because I am at heart a West Coast boy.
I'm a West Coast as well. We always joke West Coast is the best coast over here. No offense to the East Coast listeners. I know it's great there too. I love coming in. I love being on the East Coast because I get to wear the most posh clothes, you know, and it just, here everybody's always so laid back. You don't have a chance to wear your fun posh clothing. So
yeah, right.
Thank you so much for being on this show. We really appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure.
Yes,
great pleasure.
Thank you. And for all of you watching, thank you again for watching. And until I see you again, may the Lord bless and keep you, cause his face to shine upon you, and nourish your soul.